U.S. Vice President JD Vance says the latest round of indirect nuclear talks with Iran in Geneva, quote, went well in some ways, even though they ended without agreement. But he said Iran had failed to acknowledge some of the red lines that Donald Trump has set. The U.S. president has threatened another attack on Iran unless it agrees to a nuclear deal. Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, says his government is open to verification that it's not seeking to develop a nuclear weapon, but he insists it will never completely abandon its nuclear program.
A show of force in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's elite Revolutionary Guards staged naval drills, a message to Washington as the U.S. builds up its military presence in the region. The USS Abraham Lincoln has been spotted off the coast of Oman. Another aircraft carrier strike group is on the way to the Middle East. The buildup prompting a warning from Iran's supreme leader.
They keep saying we have sent warships towards Iran. Okay, of course a warship is a dangerous device. But more dangerous than that is a weapon that can send a warship deep under the sea.
Both sides flexing military muscle as a second round of nuclear talks took place in Geneva. Washington wants Iran to make a deal to limit its nuclear program or risk facing more U.S. attacks. Tehran says it won't make concessions without relief from crippling sanctions. Iran's foreign minister said the negotiations had made good progress.
There's no actual roadmap yet, but we now have a clear picture of what needs to be done and what steps should follow. Of course, both sides still hold positions that will take time to narrow. But at least now we have a set of guiding principles and a clear path to move forward on.
The threat of U.S. military action has left ordinary Iranians on edge.
Nobody wants a war. Given that Iran is isolated from the rest of the world, I think it would be much better if there's no conflict.
Many here also have mixed feelings about the U.S. making a deal with their country's theocratic leadership after it carried out a vicious crackdown on nationwide anti-regime protests.
I think it's fair to assess that there is a clear majority in Iran who do not want to see any kind of dirty deal that would cement the reign of the Islamic Republic of the regime in Iran to the detriment of Iranian people. For instance, via sanctions relief that the rulers in Tehran, as they did in the past, would primarily use for their own purposes of regime stability and the projection of regime strength in the region.
And anger with the Islamic Republic still visible even after the crackdown that killed thousands. On Tuesday, protesters returned to the streets to demand regime change.
Iranians are meanwhile marking 40 days, the traditional period of mourning for Muslims, since the deadly crackdown against anti-regime protests in January. And while communication with those inside the Islamic Republic remains difficult, videos circulating on social media show large gatherings like this one at a cemetery in Abdanan. That's a city in Iran's western Ilam province, where people are holding a memorial ceremony and shouting anti-regime slogans, such as Death to Khamenei. Other videos recorded in the same location show security forces in armored vehicles and opening fire. Well, verification of such pictures is difficult, but the news agency Reuters says the topography and layouts visible match satellite images of Iran. All right, let's now speak to Behnam Ben Taleblu. He's Senior Director of the Iran Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington. Behnam, welcome. Are these isolated incidents that we're seeing right now, or are we seeing the potential return of protests to the streets of Iran as we mark this 40-day mourning period?
Well, great to be with you. I think no doubt the population is looking for the next available opportunity to safely continue to voice their discontent with the Islamic Republic and to create the political and social conditions to push past it, as your report rightly noted, altogether. These mourning ceremonies offer actually the potential to do that. However, given the use of force and indeed live fire, by security forces against protesters and against mourners and against those commemorating those who were killed during these protests, who, very interestingly, by the way, the population does not call martyrs, but calls eternal names or Javid Noms, just in yet another divide between state and society in that country. Iranians are likely going to continue to look for these sorts of avenues to continue to voice their discontent. So we shouldn't be shocked. I saw similar videos in Zanjan today, which is a province also in the west, but in the northwest compared to this, which is in the southwest, and a few others proliferating on social media as well.
We're also seeing mass protests by the Iranian diaspora last weekend and a couple of days recently here as well. Do those play a role in fueling this, at least back home, or do they sort of whip up this kind of sentiment that's growing or that hasn't been dampened?
Well, trust me, the level of anger and dissatisfaction and grief and discontent in Iran needs no one to fuel it. But certainly the diaspora has played a very critical role, I would say, in echoing the voices, the views, the values, and even the interests, and even the slogans, you could say, of their families, friends, loved ones, and compatriots back in their native homeland. You've seen protests not just in Munich, Germany, alongside the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, where the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi spoke, but also in far-off places like Tokyo, like Seoul, like New Zealand, like Australia, across cities in America, and in particular Canada, the UK, the EU. Certainly, Iranians in the diaspora, perhaps even more so than during the 2022-2023 Women Life Freedom Movement, have turned out en masse in a more unified way than I have actually seen ever in my young adult lifetime, to echo again the plight of their compatriots, and to have Washington and any other capital that they may be protesting in front of hear that protest, hear that slogan, and actually be able to incorporate standing with the street in principle and in practice into each country's Iran policy.
When we look at the security forces' responses in Iran, why is there a need to confront those who are mourning, essentially? Why do we see such a harsh crackdown by those simply mourning the deaths of those who passed away?
Well, we've seen some real abuses by security forces, lawmakers, and several other regime figures throughout the 3.5 weeks of the national uprising in Iran in late December and through most of January, almost 20 days of which, by the way, was coterminous with an internet blackout. So abuse, even at this stage, at the 40-day mark of one of the major mourning ceremonies, is not shocking, is not surprising. The heavy-handedness that we saw the regime use weapons of war, particularly between January 8 and January 9, where 36 to 43,000 were reported killed, should leave nothing to shock, should leave nothing to surprise, given the level of violence we've seen from state against society. There were reports about people's throats being cut with box cutters. There were reports about security forces entering hospitals and killing people. There were reports about summary executions, about 417 per an independent human rights report outside of held in the United States from January to February, about the number of people the regime has executed, and not just those that were killed on the street. So this level of barbarism, this level of brutality is more proof, in my view, that state is at war with society inside Iran, and that treatment of mourners and ceremony funeral goers is unfortunately just the latest iteration of that.
Behnam, what influence do these protests have on the bigger picture of these negotiations in Iran? We heard in that piece that there may be a desire from many Iranians that there is not a kind of dirty deal, that is one that supports this regime going further. What can we say, as briefly as you can? We're running out of time here, unfortunately.
Well, no doubt the vast number of Iranians who came out into the streets don't want to see any kind of diplomacy or deal with the Islamic Republic. And one reason actually why the regime is engaging with America, a regime that it chants death to America too, by the way, one reason that they're doing this is they're trying to dishearten Iranian protesters who were promised by President Donald Trump that help was on the way, that they would hold those who engage in the crackdown against them responsible. So certainly the regime's logic here is chilling, and that's to try to kind of take the wind out of the wings of Iranian protesters. And Iranian protesters, therefore, would not look favorably on any kind of diplomatic engagement that gives staying power, life, resources, and even financial wherewithal to this regime that is doing everything it can to repress society.
All right, that's Behnam Ben Taleblu with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies in Washington. Behnam, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's unpack all this with William Alberque. He's a former NATO official and now senior fellow with the Pacific Forum. Welcome back to DW, William. How do you see it? Has real progress been made here, or are both sides really just trying to buy time?
It's possible that there has been some progress. The very fact that Iran is talking about verification, the fact that the Iranian team met with IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi earlier in this week to talk about technical matters, probably related to on-site inspection, may mean progress is happening. However, we do know that Iran is also continuing to work on buried facilities, including what's possibly a new enrichment facility near Natanz in Iran. So they may also just be biding time once again.
One way or another, it doesn't really look like these talks are going to produce a deal anytime soon. Does U.S. President Donald Trump have the patience to wait for results?
I don't think he really does. And I think he feels like he doesn't have to. He has one aircraft carrier in the region. He has a second on its way. He can strike these facilities again. He can strike Iranian leadership. And quite frankly, he doesn't have any real pressure to sign a deal. In fact, he's got some folks in the US and in Israel who don't want him to do a deal. So actually, Iran is the one that really has to make a deal if it doesn't want to see another attack.
It wouldn't be the first deal the two sides strike. Is there enough trust at this point, though, on both sides for it to, endure this time?
I don't think there's enough trust. I don't think the Iranians would trust the United States, but I don't think they have the choice. I honestly think with the successful raid back in June, the U.S. demonstrating that it can penetrate Iranian defenses so easily, the pressure is on Iran now. And quite frankly, whatever deal the United States wants, I think it's going to end up getting. I think even if Iran tries to sprint towards a bomb, it'll just invite more destruction on itself. I really think the best course out is to work with the U.S. and the IAEA, give up its capabilities, and have strict verification of remaining within the limits set with the IAEA and the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement.
And the Iranian president has said today that he's open to verification that Tehran is in fact not seeking a nuclear weapon. What could that look like?
Well, so what that would look like is they would have to downblend, to dilute the stuff that they've already enriched up to 60% highly enriched uranium. That's near weapons grade. They would have to dilute that down to 3% or below, maybe 3.67%, something like that. Or they'd have to ship it out of the country like they did back in 2015, ship it to Russia to be downblended. And they would need on-site verification at any facility where Iran may be enriching facility or planning to enrich, maybe building centrifuges to help them enrich. They would need to be more transparent to allow IAEA inspectors wherever they need to go.
And from your perspective, is a deal with the Islamic Republic really the best way to end the threat the country's nuclear program poses?
Ultimately, the nuclear program is a symptom of Iranians' feeling about its place in the region, the threats it feels under. So I think it would need more talks with the United States, with the Gulf states, to try to figure out an equilibrium so Iran stops sponsoring terrorism, stops sponsoring Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis, and comes to a real regional peace with its neighbors. Otherwise, the nuclear program is just a symptom of all these other issues that Iran has and its feelings of wanting to dominate the region or to fight the United States. So it's going to need some broader peace agreement, but a nuclear program stop would be a good first step. So let's see if we can negotiate that first and then the rest later.
How does Israel feel about all of this?
I'm not really sure. I mean, why was Netanyahu in the White House late last week? Was it to try to convince Trump not to do a deal? Or were they setting terms for what a deal would look like? We're just not sure. Netanyahu usually comes out and says a lot about these meetings, but he's been relatively quiet. So maybe they've come to some sort of agreement that the U.S. will try. And if Iran balks at a deal, then they strike. And maybe Israel supports that. But, in the longer term, I think Israel is very concerned that if there is a longer term deal and a rapprochement with Iran and the United States, that Israel might lose out. So it's not really in Netanyahu's benefit, but neither is Iran with a nuclear weapon.
Now, while these negotiations are going on, both the U.S. president and Iran's supreme leader have issued threats of military attacks against each other. What can we read into that?
I mean, Iran is trying to ratchet up pressure with leverage that it just doesn't have. Its missile forces were decimated in the June strikes by Israel and the United States. It's trying to regenerate that capability, but it's going to be a while. Its support for Hamas and Hezbollah have blown up in its face. It's lost its toehold in Syria. So Iran is really on the back foot. I would feel like this is a really empty threat, whereas the U.S., is putting a lot of power into the region. Now, it's not going to invade Iran. I don't know if it could really topple the regime, but it can certainly do a lot of damage to Iran's government, to its military, to its economic output. So Iran's going to really, really be under the gun here. And these threats, I think, from Iran are just a bit empty.
William Alberque, always great to have you on the show. Thanks so much.
Thank you.